This is a quiet voice. Tonight, I want to share a story about a human choice, one that almost destroyed a family and stayed with me longer than I ever expected. The old shop smelled of cedar dust and patience, a scent that hung in the air like a heavy curtain that refused to move. Inside, Elias stood over his workbench with his back to the door, his hands moving in a slow, practiced rhythm perfected over 40 years of making violins. But today his hands were trembling just a little. Not because of his age or the cold draft sneaking in through the window frame, but because of the letter that sat open on the counter behind him, a letter that he had read 3 times since the sun came up. And it was strange how a single sheet of paper could weigh more than the blocks of maple and spruce stacked in the corner, those heavy wedges of timber that he had carried and carved for decades. Yet this paper felt heavier because it was signed by his daughter, Sarah, who he had not seen in 5 years, and the letter did not say she was coming to visit for a holiday or to ask how he was doing, but rather it said she was coming to discuss the future of the shop, a future that Elias had always assumed would belong to her. But now he wasn't sure if there was anything left to give. So Elias picked up a piece of rough spruce wood from his bench and ran his thumb over the grain lines, thinking about how wood is a living thing even after it is cut, because he knew a fact about this wood that most people never think about, which is that the best wood for a violin comes from trees that grew in harsh, cold climates where the sun is weak and the winter is long, causing the tree to grow very slowly. And this slow growth packs the grain lines incredibly tight together, making the wood dense and strong so it can transmit sound with a purity that softer, fast-growing wood can never achieve. And he thought about how Sarah had grown up in this shop, surrounded by the smell of varnish and the sound of rasping files. But unlike the slow-growing spruce that needed hardship to become beautiful, Elias had tried to protect her from every cold wind, shielding her from failure and disappointment until she felt suffocated by his care. And perhaps that was why she left, growing too fast and too loose like a sapling in a hot summer, unable to hold the tension of the strings he tried to put on her life. And now as he held the dense wood, he wondered if the hardship of the last 5 years had changed her grain, or if she was still the same. Because just as he wondered if anything broken could still be repaired, the bell above the door chimed. A bright and sharp sound that cut through the silence of the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. And Elias froze, his hand hovering over the chisel, his heart giving a single, hard thump against his ribs as he turned around slowly to see a silhouette standing in the doorway, framed by the bright street outside. And even though the light was in his eyes, he knew the posture, the tilt of the head, and the way she held her bag tight against her side, as if she were bracing for a collision. And Sarah stepped inside, letting the door close behind her with a soft click that seemed to seal them both inside the quiet room. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other across the expanse of half-finished instruments and scattered tools. And Elias saw that she looked older, her face a little thinner, her eyes holding a tiredness that he had never seen before. And he wanted to rush forward and hug her, to bridge the gap with his arms, but his feet felt nailed to the floorboards, paralyzed by the fear that she might step back if he moved. "So, hello, Dad," she said, her voice sounding smaller than he remembered, lacking the confident projection she used to have when she played the cello in the high school orchestra. And Elias cleared his throat, nodding once as he wiped his hands on his apron, trying to think of the right thing to say, something that would acknowledge the years of silence without blaming her for them. But all he could manage was a quiet hello, Sarah, which felt inadequate for the size of the moment. Yet it was the only starting point he had. And he watched as she walked further into the room, her eyes scanning the shelves, and she ran a finger along the edge of a workbench, looking at the dust that came away on her skin. And she told him she didn't have much time, that she had a flight back to the city in 2 days, and that whatever decision they made would be final, and that they needed to be realistic about the business because she had seen the accounts and knew he was behind on the rent. And as she spoke about numbers and liquidation and market value, Elias felt a coldness settle in his stomach, realizing that she hadn't come to reconnect with him, but to dismantle the only life he had ever known. And he listened without interrupting, his eyes drifting to a battered black case in the corner of the room, a case that contained an old cello he had started repairing months ago, but never finished. And he suddenly felt a desperate need to show her that not everything was about money or efficiency, that some things were worth saving simply because they had a voice waiting to be heard. So he walked over to the corner and picked up the case, interrupting her mid-sentence by placing it gently on the workbench between them, and Sarah stopped talking and looked at the case, her brow furrowing in confusion, and she asked him what he was doing, why he was bringing out old junk when they needed to talk about the lease. But Elias just opened the latches, revealing the cello inside, which had a nasty crack running down its front, a wound in the wood that looked fatal to anyone who didn't know the secrets of his trade. And he looked at her and said, "Before we talk about selling the shop, I need your help with this one last repair, just for today." And she sighed, a sound of frustration that reminded him of her teenage years, and she started to argue, saying she hadn't held a tool in years and that she wasn't a luthier. She was a frantic project manager for a software firm now. But Elias quietly insisted, handing her a warm, damp cloth and telling her that the wood didn't care about her job title. It only cared about her hands, and slowly, reluctantly, she put her bag down and took the cloth, the muscle memory of her childhood taking over as she began to wipe the old rosin from the fingerboard, and as they worked side by side, the silence between them began to change, shifting from an awkward, heavy wall into something more companionable, the kind of quiet that comes from shared focus, and Elias began to prepare the glue pot, heating the mixture of granules and water until it reached the perfect consistency, and he decided to tell her the second fact about his work, something he hoped she would understand on a deeper level than just carpentry. So he stirred the pot and said, "You remember why we use this glue, Sarah?" And she looked at the amber liquid and shook her head, saying she forgot. So Elias explained that in violin making they use traditional hide glue, which is made from animal connective tissue, and while it creates a bond stronger than the wood itself, it has a magical property called reversibility, meaning that if a repair goes wrong, or if the instrument needs to be opened 100 years from now, a little heat and moisture will cause the glue to release its hold without tearing the wood, allowing mistakes to be undone without permanent damage. And he saw Sarah pause, her hand resting on the neck of the cello, and he continued speaking softly, looking at the glue rather than her face, telling her that modern synthetic glues are permanent and brittle. And if you try to undo a bond made with them, you rip the wood apart and destroy the instrument. But the old ways were designed with forgiveness in mind, designed with the understanding that things break, especially families, and need to be fixed again and again, and that nothing should ever be so rigid that it cannot be opened and healed. And Sarah stood very still, and Elias saw a tear slip silently down her cheek, landing on the dusty floor, because they both knew he wasn't just talking about the cello anymore. He was talking about the harsh words they had exchanged 5 years ago, the permanent decrees he had made about her life, and the rigid pride she had held onto in her absence. And for the first time, the metaphor of the hide glue hung in the air between them, offering a possibility that their relationship wasn't shattered by modern permanence, but held together by something that could be warmed and reset. "And I made mistakes," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she finally looked at him, admitting that her life in the city wasn't the grand success she pretended it was, that she was lonely and tired and missed the smell of sawdust, but she was too ashamed to come back and admit she had been wrong to leave. And Elias felt his own heart crack open, realizing that he had been waiting for her to apologize when he should have been the one to apply the warmth to the joint. So he walked around the bench and placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her frame. And he told her that the shop was struggling because he had lost his reason to build, that a violin maker who doesn't believe in the future can't make instruments that sing, and he admitted that he didn't care about the rent or the lease. He only cared that she was here now, and he asked her if they could try to clamp the crack in the cello together, just to see if it would hold, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand and nodded, picking up the clamps while Elias applied the warm glue to the fracture in the wood, working quickly before the gelatin cooled. And it was a dance they hadn't performed together in a decade, but their hands moved in sync, Elias guiding the wood together and Sarah tightening the clamps with just the right amount of pressure, neither too loose nor too tight, finding that sweet spot where the two separate pieces decided to become one again. And once the clamps were set, there was nothing to do but wait, because wood and glue cannot be rushed. So Elias went to the back of the shop and brewed a pot of tea on the hot plate, and they sat on 2 stools near the window as the afternoon light turned to the golden hue of early evening. And they drank the tea from chipped mugs, talking not about the business or the past, but about small things like the weather in the city and the way the old bakery down the street had closed. And Sarah told him about a man she had met and lost, and Elias told her about how his hands hurt when it rained. And with every small confession, the layer of ice that had covered, their relationship began to melt, revealing the solid ground beneath. And Elias realized that they were doing exactly what the wood needed to do. They were sitting in the tension, allowing the bond to cure, trusting that the time they spent doing nothing was actually the most important part of the work. And the sun went down, casting long shadows across the floor, and the shop became dark except for the street lamp outside. But neither of them moved to turn on the overhead lights, preferring the intimacy of the gloom. And Sarah asked quietly if he really wanted to sell the shop, or if he was just saying that because he thought she didn't want it. And Elias admitted that the shop was his soul. But a soul needs a successor, or else it becomes a museum, a place of dead things rather than living music. And she looked at the clamped cello sitting on the bench, its shape vague in the dim light. And she said she wasn't sure if she could be a successor, but she knew she didn't want to be a stranger anymore. And she proposed a deal that she would stay for a week to help him finish the repairs on the backlog. And in exchange, he would teach her how to carve the scroll of a violin, the one skill she had never mastered as a child because she lacked the patience for the intricate turns. And Elias smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and he agreed, feeling a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. And the next morning, they arrived at the shop early, the air crisp and cold, and they walked to the bench to remove the clamps from the cello, the moment of truth that every luthier knows, where you find out if the work was true or if the crack will open up again as soon as the pressure is released. And Sarah spun the metal handles of the clamps, loosening them one by one. Her breath held tight in her chest, and as the last clamp came away, the wood held firm, the crack invisible except for a thin, hairline scar that only added character to the instrument, proving that the bond was solid. And Elias handed her a set of strings, nodding for her to finish the job, to bring the voice back to the silent wooden body, and she wound the strings onto the pegs, turning them slowly to bring them up to pitch, the tension on the neck increasing with every turn. And Elias watched her hands, seeing the strength in her fingers that had returned overnight. And when the cello was finally tuned, she didn't hand it to him, but instead she grabbed the bow, sat down on the stool, and pulled the horsehair across the low C string, producing a deep, rich growl that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of their feet. And the sound was magnificent, full of the sorrow and the joy that the wood had absorbed over its life. And Sarah closed her eyes and began to play a simple melody, a folk song that Elias used to hum when she was a baby, and the music filled the dusty corners of the shop, chasing away the shadows and the silence. And Elias stood there listening, realizing that the crack in the wood hadn't ruined the sound, but had given it a new depth, a slight rasp of survival that made it more beautiful than a perfect, untouched instrument. And when she finished, the final note hung in the air for a long time, fading slowly until it was just a memory in their ears. And Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bright, and said she didn't want to sell, that she wanted to see what else they could fix if they just used the right glue and gave it enough time. And Elias nodded, knowing that the hard winter was over and the slow growth of the new season had begun. And they spent the rest of the week working. And though they didn't fix everything in 7 days, they fixed the things that mattered, establishing a new rhythm where Sarah handled the books and the customers while Elias taught her the secrets of the wood. And on the day she was supposed to leave, she canceled her flight, calling her boss to say she needed a leave of absence because she had realized that building something that lasts for centuries was more important than managing projects that were forgotten in a month. And Elias watched her carving a scroll at the bench, her brow furrowed in concentration. And he knew that eventually she would be better than him, that her hands would make instruments that he could only dream of. And he felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that his legacy wasn't the wood or the shop, but the woman sitting before him, who had learned that broken things can be mended if you are willing to apply warmth and patience. And it is a lesson we often forget in a world that rushes to throw away what is damaged. But the luthier knows the truth, that the strongest joint is the one that has been broken and healed, and that love, like the best hide glue, is reversible, forgiving, and capable of holding us together even after we have fallen apart, which is the only way any of us ever become whole again. A quiet voice, sharing a human story and reminding us that some things are worth fixing.